Hello, everyone. My name is Gitika Gorthy, and today I'm very, very excited and honored to be interviewing a very special space champion, Miss Kelli Kedis Ogborn. Kelli is the Vice President of Space Commerce and Entrepreneurship at Space Foundation, where she leverages her expertise to spearhead Space Commerce Institute, an initiative designed to deliver informed insight and actionable programming to help companies and individuals find their market share and grow within the burgeoning space economy. Prior to joining Space Foundation, Kelli was President and Chief Operating Officer of Advanced Rockets Corporation, President and Chief Executive Officer of HS Dracones, and was contracted as the Congressional Liaison to the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as DARPA. And in the DARPA liaison role, she provided advice to senior leadership and technical offices on congressional engagement strategies to maintain the agency's position and reputation as a premier science and technology organization. Kelli is also a fellow G100 member in Aerospace and Aviation, which is how I was able to get connected with her. And as you can see from her background, she is incredibly, a visionary leader of the aerospace sector and is leading it in from so many different facets. And I'm so excited to learn about Kelli's journey of what inspired her to pursue an aerospace career and how already at such a young stage of her career was already able to achieve so much. So welcome, Kelli. Thank you so much for taking your time to inspire the next generation of aerospace leaders.
No, I appreciate the invitation and thank you for the very kind introduction. It's always funny to hear your bio read because you remember you're like, oh yeah, I did all those things. But
yeah. Yeah, I remember reading through the work that you've already done, and it's honestly mind-blowing how there are so many agencies, organizations focused on advancing the space economy and how you've already been a part of so many already. So I'm really excited about your journey and what you think about the future of the space economy and industry. But to kick off our conversation, I wanted to ask about your typical day. Usually there is never a typical day for any professional, but if you generally had to talk about your structure of how you like to, lay out your day, what does your day normally look like and what does your job currently entail?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a lot of things, which I like to say it's because it's never a dull moment. So as you mentioned in the beginning, my title at Space Foundation and what I do is Space Commerce Institute, I'll unpack a little bit more of what that is because that really encapsulates what we do. So I officially joined Space Foundation a year and a half ago. They were a client of mine actually for a long time when I ran HS Dracones, which was a company focused on tech commercialization and lab to market strategy for engineers and science-minded folks. And I started working with the Space Foundation to help non-traditional entities scale into space. So we did workshops around the country in 2019. And what we wanted to do was really illuminate what the opportunities were in space, but then take these nascent industries and backgrounds, whether it's art, media, or folks that were more traditionally located to space and help them figure out how to scale their path. So we did that for a while. And then in 2021, as this whole concept of new space was really starting to heat up, not that it was heating up, but it was becoming more known. People were starting to understand that space economy was a word, space commerce was a word, new space was a word. I came in officially and launched Space Commerce Institute. And so it's about a year and a half old. And what it does is it really focuses on growth into and growth within the future of space. And so what that looks like from a day-to-day practicality stance is different based on who we're doing it for. So I'm based in the Washington, D.C. office it's Arlington, Virginia, but it's our DC-based office. Space Foundation headquarters is in Colorado Springs. But we work with lots of different client sets, both all around the country and also all around the world. And so what we focus on every day is different types of program offerings. So one example is we have on-demand courses and workshops that are available for anyone, really. And what those are meant to do is bridge knowledge gaps in between how to build and scale businesses in space. So what we focus on is the business side of it. We want to be able for people to understand where their background, where their technological capability, where their interest fits, and then create a roadmap around it. So we have on-demand products and services, but the bulk of our work are actually tailored programs. So we run different space business focused incubators and accelerators around the country right now. We have one really big program in South Florida at the Levan Center of Innovation called Level 5 Space Doc, where we run everything from space business cohorts. Like I said, we graduated 2. We're just about to start 2 more. We're also about to unravel a Life in Mars. It's called Life on Mars. It's going to be in January, but it's going to be a 72-hour Mars simulation habitat. So we're going to use the different innovation zones within the Levan Center and center teams that have individual challenges. Might be like, how do you grow and sustain food for a colony? How do you design the next generation spacesuit? And then how do they all work together to sustain life on Mars? In addition to that program, we also do different speaker series like workshops and panel discussions around the space economy. So that's one example of a program. We also have programs running at universities where we come in and do space economy workshops or modules that are enhancements to existing curriculum. So instead of designing curriculum that's going to be a semester long, we will come in, and for business students or for engineering students, we have different like 2-hour video modules with an in-person component that will be everything from like, what is space adjacency, which is one of my favorite topics. Like, how do you take industries that are going to be relevant to the growth of space and scale it into that? And then we also have different consulting projects going on. So it's never really a dull moment because we have lots of different project verticals that we interact with, but all of them center on growth into and growth within the future of space.
Yeah, that's incredible. I think just hearing your response, it made me realize how large the space economy is and what we need to do to tackle this, from being able to bridge the talent gap, what you're doing by going into universities, having these virtual modules and programs, but then also working on consulting for these new startup companies or companies that are not originally space-based, and making them apply their work into the space sector is just incredible. And I'm just excited to see how this industry and how this market will continue to grow. I heard this quote from another speaker, and they were saying every company is a space company. They just don't know it yet. And so I think the work you're doing directly corresponds to that. You want to show every company that they'll research their tools or do have a relevancy to the space sector and space exploration. So I think that's incredible what you're doing. And that makes me think about startups and the startup culture in the space sector. What do you think about a startup in the space economy? Do you think it's difficult to enter the space sector, or do you think it's relatively easier compared to other industries?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. That's a good one. I think there's both sides of it. There are a lot of opportunities and there are a lot of challenges. So I would say relative to other industries, there is a lot of opportunity in space. So the good news, and one of the things that I, am really passionate about, and you kind of touched upon it, that every company is a space company. The main thing that I always say is that there is a place in space for everyone. It is every skill set, background, interest, technology. It's just a matter of finding where that insertion point is for the actual thing that you want to do. So we are really fortunate to live in the space industry as it is now and as it is evolving. We are moving out of this Apollo era, which very much served a very particular purpose. But the Apollo era was very structured, where it was vertically integrated. You had, government agencies and entities essentially just setting the directives and the funding, and then kind of putting it down on the supply chain. Now, in the era of Artemis, it's a lot more collaborative. It's very much this duality between, commercial and government intersection. And so it's going to take the creativity of everyone to be able to grow and scale the future. So that's the opportunity piece. The challenge is finding then where you should do it. So the problem that I vastly believe that the space economy has, or the space industry has, is that we talk to ourselves a lot. We talk in acronyms, we talk in statistics, we talk in ways that if you're already in it, you understand what it means. But if you're on the outside looking in, you don't know what that means. And that is the main reason why I started Space Commerce Institute, is because what we do is we distill what the opportunities are, what they mean for the business, and actually how you can take advantage of it. So from a startup perspective, a lot of companies are interested in space because space is fantastic. I mean, as humans, we have always been fascinated by space. And one of the things about the industry that I'll say a lot is that like, we don't have an optics problem. Like everyone thinks space is cool. So at a baseline recruitment, people are like, yes, I want to be part of it. But there's two things from that. So there's the companies that know that they want to be part of it, but they don't know when. And I see one of the challenges that some startups have is that they will get really razzle dazzled by the future things. So they will say, okay, well, I know that asteroid mining might be something in the future. I know that we are going to have lunar colonies. I know we were going to have Mars colonies. Those are not the ventures that investors are investing in right now because there's no business case. They are investing in things that are a lot more local. They are investing on the utilization of space-based data from satellites. They are investing on potential technologies that are going to revolutionize business opportunities in low Earth orbit. And so sometimes like startups can get ahead of themselves because while they might have a really interesting problem set, the business case isn't there yet. And then they will get discouraged thinking there isn't a place for them. On the other side with startups is that some of them have never considered space to be part of their strategy. And this is one of the other things that we try to do is that we try to show, okay, in the 3, 5, 7, 10-year roadmap of space, these different industries are going to be relevant to grow and sustain. So when we have commercial space stations in low Earth orbit, which we will, very soon, what are the kind of autonomy technologies? What is the AR, VR? What are the refueling depots? What are those technologies that are going to sustain? Once we go to the moon, how do we actually allow humans to preserve life there? What are the agriculture, environmental assessment? I mean, so it's all of those aspects that people need to consider their space strategy, but know when it's relevant for them to enter, because that I think is going to allow them to create a tangible roadmap, to not be discouraged, to know when they need to talk to a potential partner, to know when they need to talk to an investor. So it's the practical piece. It's not the dreamer piece, right? There's a ton of opportunity. It's just how to take advantage of it.
Yeah, that's honestly a great insight. From the outside perspective, as a student, aspiring entrepreneur, just hearing what you're saying is so important. I think for everyone to realize who wants to enter the space industry or has a mindset of having a startup. I think realizing that there are opportunities, many opportunities in the space sector in so many different disciplines, in this larger interdisciplinary field, but then also realizing the applications to the work that you're thinking of or the technology you're thinking of. When is it applicable? Are you relying on other technologies to be built first or something to be achieved before your startup actually comes to fruition? Like you were mentioning, I heard of this company that's developing, suits to live on Mars one day.
Yeah.
And I think, it's a great startup idea, but also you're waiting for humans to be able to get to Mars. And for all of those medical obstacles to be overcome before that becomes a reality. And so it's definitely the feasibility aspect that's also so important to think about. And even when you were mentioning, I think it comes back to also finding applications to benefiting life on Earth all the time. Space is, I've heard this really great phrase, which is space is for Earth. Every advancement, every exploration that we do, every technological advancement comes back down to Earth to benefit life. And so if your startup can have the benefit of advancing space exploration, but benefiting life on Earth, it makes it even better for investors to have the incentive to invest in your startup. So I think that's an incredible insight, a great way to look at it. And from your experience, when I was, reading your background, I mentioned how you had dipped your feet in both the government, the federal side, as well as the commercial side. And so I'm curious to hear, how do you see the relationship between commercial and federal aerospace companies evolving over time and the relationship? Do you think the commercial companies will take charge as opposed to historically what the federal government has done? Or how do you see the dynamics between both groups changing over time?
Yeah, that is the critical piece now. One thing I want to mention just really quick about something you touched upon about space being for Earth, 1000%. So an interesting statistic that I always tell folks is, so the Space Foundation every year puts out a space economy number. We just released the new space economy number this Tuesday, actually, for 2022, and it came in at $546 billion, which is massive. The thing to consider for that is that is already halfway there to the $1 trillion projection that they say we're going to get to from 2040. But of that 546 billion, 95% of the ROI of the space industry is the space to Earth market. So this further illuminates the point that you made, is that it is local. It is your cell phone. Like your cell phone has 13 to 14 different space technologies in it, embedded to even make it work. And then any apps that you use, that's utilizing space-based data. The fact that we're even able to Zoom right now is using space-based data. So the broadband, telecommunications, kind of all of these things that have been so ubiquitously intertwined that make our life so seamless that we don't realize we have the space industry to thank for it. So from an entrepreneurial aspect, it is, yes, it is considering that as part of your strategy, because there are plenty of ways that you can utilize space to better life on Earth, but your business doesn't have to be space bound, right? You're just engaged in space. And I tell people that sometimes, and they're like, "Oh, I didn't even think that." I'm like, "Well, did you order yesterday?" Like, you're still utilizing it, right? So the more that people realize that there is extreme heritage and interaction with space on a daily basis, I think the creativity starts to unfold in terms of how you can use it, and especially around the space data area, because we are seeing this massive proliferation of satellites. It doubled. The amount of satellites that existed doubled between 2020 and 2022, just doubled. So up until 2020, there were about 2,500 satellites. Between 2020 and 2022, that doubled to 5,000. And then in the next 10 years, they think it's going to get to about 100,000.
That's crazy.
So, and a lot of that is driven by companies like Elon Musk, Starlink, with the proliferation of a lot of these satellites in low Earth orbit. But what that means is there's going to be more space data, right? More connectivity, all of these opportunities to utilize it. So it's definitely an entrepreneurial area that people need to consider about how it's going to change the landscape. In terms of the government and commercial piece, that's a great question. And it's a really critical one. So I alluded in the beginning that, the Apollo era now into the Artemis era. And it's a really necessary shift, and it's a good shift. So when you think about we always joke that it's like this aerospace industry isn't our grandfather's aerospace industry, because it's not. But we have a lot of stature to thank for it. And so when Apollo happened, mainly the reason to go to the moon was national posturing, because we were in a space race with Russia. I mean, it is what it is. And it achieved so many amazing things, but national posturing and going to the moon came first, and technological progression and scientific exploration came second. We still did achieve amazing things. But as I alluded to before, the way that it was structured is that it was government funding, government priority, and then vertically integrated down. We are now shifting into an area where we're going back to the moon. It's still national posturing. I mean, people want to be able to go back to the moon and have their country, right, and their flag represented. But really, it's going back for a much broader scientific and humanity purpose. Because when we go back to the moon in 2025, we want to be able to establish moon colonies, do research and manufacturing, and do all of these things. To do that, though, it cannot be just one country leading the way, and it cannot just be government. Because if you think about the funding levels between commercial and government, the levers are different. The commercial has a lot more money. A commercial has a lot more agility. However, the government is still setting the pace and the direction of where we are going in space. And so the way that I sort of see it playing out is that in a lot of ways, and I'm just going to use Artemis as an example, is Artemis very much signaled the priority of not just the United States, but globally what we want to do in space. And it's almost up to the commercial companies to bring the technology and ingenuity to do it. So NASA and these agencies will always serve as the North Star, right? They are always going to say, this is where we're going. We want to inspire the next generation. But commercial companies have a bit more agility to be able to create the technology at a quicker pace, but then become suppliers to the government. So what a lot of people don't realize, like one of SpaceX's biggest customers is the US government. They are a government contractor. And so there really isn't a commercial company that exists without interacting with the government. When I was helping with Advanced Rockets Corporation, as you mentioned, when we would go and talk to investors, the number one question they would ask us is, what government agency is interested in you? across the board. They wanted to know if we had contracts, if we had grants, if we had a customer base, if we had pledges for a customer base, if we got to a certain part of technical fruition. And so the government will always be part of a commercial strategy because the government is a regulator, it's a validator. If you think of anything being launched, the government regulates it. So there is this duality, push and pull. I will say that I think that the future, though, is going to be technically built by commercial companies, but NASA will have a piece of it. An example is with the commercial space stations, which I mentioned before. I did an interview somewhat recently with Clay Mowry from Voyager Space, and he was talking about the business case of commercial space stations, because that's on a lot of people's minds. And I hadn't heard it phrased like this before, but it makes a lot of sense. So with, for the viewers, if you probably know about commercial space stations, but I'll just give a primer view. So the International Space Station, is a joint effort between a lot of different countries. It started out as the United States and Russia post-Cold War, but Italy has accounted for about 50% of the habitat build, and a lot of other countries interact. It is old. It's 30 years old. It's getting replaced. So it's in its retirement. NASA has put out contracts, and it has awarded them to 4 different companies that are going to put up space stations in low Earth orbit. And what's interesting about the model is that the commercial space stations are going to continue the work of the International Space Station. So NASA is going to be able to put their research and whatever they need to do on them. But these commercial space stations are also going to be able to work with private companies, that if the private companies want to lease space to be able to manufacture things in different conditions, they can. So NASA realized that instead of building something whole scale, why not just change the business model and have the commercial companies do it, and then they utilize it? So it's a flip of the paradigm, but it's still very connected, and it will continue to be that way.
Yeah, and that is probably one of the most insightful answers I've ever received for that type of question. Just hearing your perspective on how the dynamic will evolve, but how, you mentioned in a really great way of like, it's like the guide, the government will be the guide always for, the direction of where these commercial space companies will be investing their time, as, the government is giving the most money to these commercial companies to be able to carry out their operations. And just seeing the commercial companies accelerating this process, because everyone wants to get a contract with the government, is speeding up the space sector and advancing our technology in ways we've never seen 20, 30 years before.
Oh, yeah.
And so, so I think this is absolutely so exciting, and just hearing your insights on it, and the dynamic was just perfectly explained. And as you were talking, I just couldn't help but notice how insightful and knowledgeable you were, not only on this topic, but everything I've asked about before. And I think it's because you've had so many really great experiences, but I'm sure it also stems from your passion for the space sector. And so I'm really curious to hear, what was the aha moment that inspired you to pursue a career in the space sector and become so passionate about these topics, especially because a lot of the work that you've done is more on the business, the economy, the commerce side of things, as opposed to the traditional hardcore rocket science or STEM-based work. And so I think this is a really cool intersection that I'm personally very intrigued by as well. And so how did you get into the space industry? What was your aha moment?
It's a very non-linear path, I will tell you that. So academically, I'm a sociologist. So my undergrad and my master's degree was in conflict resolution. I am actually classically trained in the why people go to war, right? So what I used to do is look at it was always like the ethnic, religious, tribal reasons why people go to conflict. So it's very kind of deeply human, but also the sociological aspects. And you mentioned in the beginning, I went to DARPA. So it was funny when I started on Capitol Hill when I came to DC. I've been in DC about 17 years. I'm originally from Southern California. Came to DC, started on the Hill, and always knew that I wanted to work in defense at large. But what does that mean? Because when you're in your early 20s, you're like, oh, all of these things seem interesting, but you don't know, right? You don't know unless you try. So I ended up at DARPA, and I did a year doing research there, which was probably one of the best starter jobs, because I had never had a classically trained technical background. And so doing research, I would get these research requests and I would see these words strung together, and I'm like, I know what all these words individually mean, but strung together, I have absolutely no idea. So it was drinking from a fire hose, but in the best possible way. And then what happened was at that time of transitioning, we were transitioning directors because the DARPA director is presidentially appointed. And the new director came in and wanted a much broader congressional strategy. And I was one of the only people in the building who had ever worked on Capitol Hill. And so it was kind of this lateral move, and it was, things, worlds align. So I ended up moving up to the director's office, and I was there for about 7 years, and I helped run the congressional strategy there. That was probably one of the most eye-opening things, because working there, because it is such a bleeding edge R&D innovation center, I got a deep love for the technical side of things. I had the human and the business side always down. It was the technical piece that I really started to understand, because I grew up believing that I was not good at math and science. So I was the kid who always had to take summer school to make up my math classes because I didn't do well. And the reason is because I am not the person that you put a bunch of math equations in front of and all of a sudden you can pump out answers, but I understand the application and I understand the underlying piece. And so it was an aha moment for me working there that I realized, oh, I'm actually good at these subjects, which is kind of a realization at 25, to realize that you've been shying away from an industry that you didn't think you belonged in to begin with. That was a big revelation. And then marrying what I was like classically trained in, like the people piece with the tech, I realized like, oh, there's a lot you can do with this. So when I left DARPA, you mentioned HS Dracones, I ran a consulting company for 7 years. And what I really focused on was lab to market strategies for technically minded people. So my greatest joy and greatest joy in life, greatest passion professionally, is to be able to see like the technical inventors of things be able to get their idea into the mainstream and get adoption of people that might not understand it off the bat. Because oftentimes, the technical folks will want to get into the bits and the bytes and the minutia, but they don't actually understand the use case and the impact to the person on the other end. And so I really bridge that while also being able to build the business piece of it. You move into space, it kind of like does have this translation. So generally when I left DARPA, I did that kind of strategy, and it was mainly for like defense technologies, right? Technologies that classically came out of defense origins, but the inventors wanted to move them into other markets. Space is a sister to defense, right? Because they interlap. And so I was always interested in space. I mean, no human isn't, as I mentioned in the beginning, but again, I didn't think there was a place for me in the industry. And then I realized through that consulting work I did with the Space Foundation that there is, because it's the same sort of application, it's just a different problem set. So it's then saying, okay, what are the problems and opportunities that space is going to bring to bear? And then how do you create those strategies for other people to take advantage of them that didn't think they were possible? And so it was partially like personal experience to say, I'm going to prove that there are people that can join the space industry. Also the fact that scaling technologies, it's just, like I said, understanding the problem set you're moving into and just moving out. And so once I had that aha moment, it was a game changer, because space is so fun and so creative. And I get to work with just brilliant people on a daily basis about a lot of creative problems that are very locally rooted, but also future oriented. And so it constantly like expands my knowledge set every day. And I learn every day from the people I work with, which is also really fun.
Yeah, wow, that's incredibly inspiring. I mean, so many students, including myself, can relate with what you just said. Growing up, I was always really excited about space, but because I didn't have family members, relatives who were in the space sector, I always assumed it was something that you have to be as smart as Albert Einstein, or you have to be a great mathematician or physicist. And I was like, it wasn't a realistic career choice, because math wasn't something I naturally was like into. I was more interested in other aspects of STEM or non-STEM skills, more as opposed to just hardcore math. And then coming into middle school, when I had the engineering elective that I took and I had a rocketry unit, it completely changed my perspective. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm 12, 13, and I can build a model rocket and like launch it. That's crazy. And I think from that it just changed my perspective on, on physics, on rocket science, and STEM in general. I feel like it seems so daunting. And yes, there are the hardest stuff comes from rocket science, but there are also aspects that you can contribute to, even if you're not the smartest physicist or the smartest mathematician. And there are other, interdisciplinary facets as well, like you explained, in business, in commerce, in bringing your people skills and bringing your non-STEM skills into the space sector, because every single skill set is required in the space industry. And once I had that realization, I was like, we need to share this with every student in the world, because so many kids are excited about space, want to see if aliens exist, or want to do, go to Mars or explore the outer space, but they are deterred away from it because they think it's a child's dream or it's an unrealistic career choice to go after. And I think if we can change that mindset and we can educate folks not only about pursuing space careers, but also, as you mentioned, a lot of people don't realize the benefits of space in all of their daily lives. And if we can educate that, whether it be through movies, through films, documentaries, in classrooms, it could change the future of the space sector. And I think just hearing your journey, it's just a perfect example of how you can bring in multiple skills, combine it with your interest in space, and make a great career out of it. So that's very inspiring. And did you have obstacles in your journey as you pursued your career? And if so, how did you overcome them?
Well, that's an astounding yes. I will say that I don't think it's possible for people to pursue a career and not have obstacles. It's human nature. So an absolutely astounding yes. I will say that for me, probably the biggest obstacle, there were external obstacles and internal obstacles, I think is probably the best way to say it. So externally, I will say that I fortunately always found myself in positions where I was very unique to the job. I was either very different than people that were already doing it, or I was different than the people who had come before, or it was a completely new job. I have found myself in positions where I sort of am creating the job that I want to do, which has been very fun, but it's challenging because then you're trying to prove the concept, prove the why, prove why you're doing it. So one of the ways that I had to overcome that, it was actually really good advice that I got when I was in college. So when I was in college, I was student body president. So associated students is generally what people call it across campuses. And I was the youngest that had ever been. And I was also very different than the past presidents that had before. I actually wasn't in student government at all until I ran and won. And so I was totally new coming in. Even though I had been involved in other parts of campus. And I remember I was having this moment, I was 19, I was 20, I think 19 or 20. And I was having like this existential crisis, kind of like in front of like the coffee shop on campus. And one of the professors, they came up and they were like, Kelli, there is no cookie cutter position into what this should be and look like. He goes, you were put in this position for a reason, and you need to bring your own unique talents and your own, flavor and brand and spin on it. And that really resonated with me because I felt like for a while, I kept trying to change myself to fit into the mold of what I thought somebody in this position should be, as opposed to actually relying on my natural talents and strengths and realizing like, that is why I was there. That is why I was put there. Somebody put me there for a reason. They said yes to have me sign up to do this. So I might as well be my most authentic self. And I think when people you were able to bring so much more to a job as opposed to trying to feel like you need to fit into what it is. I will say that internal turmoil, I, for a long time, struggled with imposter syndrome. I think most people do. It's actually kind of it's a misnomer because you still do. I mean, I still get intimidated by things. I think that people as a general rule should constantly do things that make themselves uncomfortable because you grow in your skill set and base. But for a long time, I would sit there and be like, am I qualified to talk on this? Like when I would get asked to go on a panel, and I absolutely was, but it was this internal struggle to see, like, to your point about the whole space industry, like there has to be somebody smarter. There has to be somebody more qualified. And a lot of times, no, like, if they're asking you to lend your voice, go and lend your voice. So there's those kind of obstacles. There's always like the other professional obstacles. One of my favorite quotes is by Winston Churchill, and it's success is moving from failure to failure with no lack of enthusiasm. I think if you are professionally aggressive and you are trying to go after things that are hard, you're going to hear no a lot. You're going to come up against brick walls, but the biggest thing that you can do is just know what your end state that you're trying to achieve, and know that there are different paths to it. I think sometimes people hear a no and they think, okay, well, my idea is terrible. And that's not the case. It's just not for everybody.
Yeah, a lot of times, even putting the same situation in the context of a student, a lot of times when you're applying to internships or a certain program, or you come out of college and you're applying for your first job, you look at job criteria, you look at some qualifications, and you're like, oh, I'm totally not qualified for that. I shouldn't even apply. And a lot of times we're scared of rejection. But as you said, if you're going to try for something bigger, it's sometimes you have to put yourself in those uncomfortable situations and just try and make that attempt. And if not everybody will reciprocate your idea, not everybody will accept your application, but you at least tried and didn't say no to yourself. Let someone else say no to you and figure out how you can improve, so next time they have to say yes. And I think just hearing your perspective on, it's so important when you have that imposter syndrome, realizing what you bring to the table and realizing everybody's different and you don't have to fit in a mold. And that's such a great way of thinking about it. A lot of times when you're running for a position, or you're filling the shoes of someone else, you think you have to be like them or emulate them. And everyone is a different human being, and so bringing your own flavor is such a great way of thinking about it. That's great advice from your professor, and I know I definitely will remember that myself, and I'm sure everyone who's listening will as well.
Well, and to your point, sorry, really quick, your point about no, though, I think what's interesting about that is it's also, when you hear no, you can't take it personally, because there are so many factors into, like, just talking about internships, there's so many factors into who get them, who doesn't get them. And it doesn't mean that you're not qualified. It's just there will be a right opportunity for you. And so also just remembering that no isn't the end of the road, and it's not a personal thing. And so what do you do with that?
Yeah, 100%. Just because someone says no, or, oh, that's too difficult of a career choice, it doesn't mean you can't do it. You could be the exception, you could be the difference. And, like you mentioned, just making sure you're following your heart and not changing yourself, and just being who you are and going after that. And definitely, seeing your story and how it worked for you, I think definitely, everyone should really take that to heart. And, now that we're able to learn about your journey as well as your insights on the space economy and the future of the space sector, my last and final question for you is, what final piece of advice — you just gave advice based off your life journey, but if you had to give one final piece of advice, to your younger self or any young professional out there regarding the pursuit of a passion in STEM, aerospace, honestly, any career, what is a piece of advice you wish you knew 20 years ago?
Ooh, so I think the piece of advice that I wish I knew was what I touched upon, is that there isn't one size fits all. The thing I will say as a piece of advice that I think has served me well is to, so obviously there's an end state that you want to achieve. I honestly, 15 years ago, if you would have asked me if I would be doing what I'm doing today, I would have absolutely said no, because like I said, my path was like this. And so I didn't necessarily know where each thing was going. However, I learned really valuable skills from each position. And so the one thing I will say is, everything that you do in life will serve you at some point. So if you do an internship, if you do a job, if you even volunteer with a certain organization, you're going to create and I guess adopt skills that will serve you at some point and will make you a lot more adaptable and multidisciplinary down the road. So I don't think that anything is wasted time in terms of the professional climb. I know that sometimes people will get upset because they're like, well, this isn't what I want to be doing now. And it's like, it's all a stepping stone. Like, I still feel in a lot of ways that I am at the beginning of my career, because there's so many other things that I want to do. And so you just gain that knowledge and you move on. And so I think that showing up to life is a really critical piece, saying yes to opportunities and doing really hard things. Obviously doing things that you may not feel like you're prepared to do yet, but that you can do. Because when you continue to put yourself out there, you are going to gain these life skills, but you will start to get the confidence and credibility and be able to move on to more difficult stuff. Like I think back to things like 5 years ago, which I was intimidated by. I now do that on a daily basis here, but now there's other things I'm intimidated by. And then I'm sure 5 years from now, it's going to be a very commonplace thing. So just push yourself, be curious. No skill is wasted, and just enjoy the ride.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice, especially, say yes to everything and, take every opportunity to its fullest. I think you can learn a skill from everything. That's, incredible advice. I think whether it be, part-time jobs or an internship or a class that you might not take and you just have to take because, it's fulfilling a requirement, taking every opportunity as a moment to learn, to
Yeah,
grow, it'll teach you something. And
it
I think
will.
that's incredible. Yeah, even as a student or a young professional or an adult in your career, already established, there's so many things you can do. And so I think that's wonderful advice. And so thank you so much, Kelly, for doing this interview. I can't even explain how much I personally learned from, the business aspect, the commerce aspect about the space sector, but also just hearing about your journey. I think it's so difficult to just learn about someone by looking at their LinkedIn or their profile and be like, oh, they accomplished so much. But just hearing it from you and your story and your journey, I could see how much hard work you put in and what you're doing to inspire students around the world. So really thank you so much for taking this opportunity to, talk with me today. And I hope we can see each other in person one day.
Yes, absolutely. No, no, this was so fun. Thank you for having me on.